which was a Latin translation. And that was a decent translation, but it's always better to get back to the original Hebrew and Greek. And it came about in large part because the Turks were going to invade Constantinople. Constantinopolitan Christians gathered up all these ancient manuscripts, took them to the West. And anyway, so that it was not just a literary renaissance, it was also a biblical renaissance. All right, next slide, number 25, lasting bitterness. The Crusades left a legacy of deep distrust between the Western Latin world and both the Islamic world and the Eastern Orthodox world. So again, it was not just unhappiness with Muslims, it was unhappiness with Orthodox Christians who had been decimated, weakened, thus making them weaker to withstand the conquest attempts by Muslim countries. And so it's not just a matter of looking back at individual events that took place 1,000 years ago or 700 years ago. The Crusades have become symbolic of a whole Eastern-Western dynamic where people in the East have largely been distrustful of Westerners and their not initial Crusades, but then later colonialism. I mean, the colonial Western colonialism colonized all of South America, you know, most of the Caribbean, and well, even the United States was a colony. Yes. We were a colony of England. And did I say Africa? All of Africa, but Ethiopia was colonized by Europe. Much of Southern Asia, India by the British, and Indonesia by the Dutch, and even the Middle Eastern countries of modern day Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Iran. They were all colonized. Many of them were colonized.
India became an English-speaking country.
Right, India.
I don't know if that's correctly to say.
Yes, it's southern Asia. I call it Southern Asia.
Do they speak a lot of English there?
Oh yeah, it's one of their official languages.
Well, one of them.
Yeah. Oh well, many countries have multiple official languages.
Oh, yeah.
I was in Madagascar about 10 years ago, and they were colonized by the French. So, they have two official languages, Malagasy and French, but all their government business is done in French, which is a legacy of, colonialism. And okay, well, I'm going to talk about some of the varieties of spirituality that arose during the medieval period, because people often look at it and say, well, what good came out of the medieval times? Well, a lot of good things came out of it. There was what was called mendicant spirituality. Mendicant simply means like an itinerant pastor who goes from place to place to place. I'd like a traveling pastor. Methodists are known for having itinerant preachers or traveling preachers. And so I like to say this is in large part how Christianity spread throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. Because initially they would just go from, the building of cathedrals were largely dependent upon the generosity of the local monarchic rulers. And so what they would do is they would build a cathedral. Well, that's good if you're within, walking distance of a cathedral, but what if you're like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 miles away? Well, there were two mendicant orders, the Dominicans following Dominic and the Franciscans following Francis. Over the centuries, they've kind of changed a bit, but initially the Dominicans emphasized preaching and later scholarship. The Franciscans emphasized simplicity and monastic life. But basically these different orders of traveling priests would then send out the priests to go from town to town in order to preach and teach, and they'd be dependent upon local cities to give them enough food and money to survive. But then what would happen is you come to a fairly big city that has a little more money, and they'd say to these traveling preachers, would you stay and be our permanent preacher? And so they would then found a little local church. And that's how Christianity spread throughout Europe, was through these mendicant orders, Dominicans, Franciscans, and then later, after the Reformation, the Jesuits. And so they would go out and they were poor preachers, and if you were really a bad one, you probably would never be asked to stay in any local area. But that's what would happen. So you go to a city either that was very wealthy and they could afford to hire one of these better ones to come and stay, or it would be a little local town that was just so nice to the local priest he'd stay, because it was a he. They didn't have female priests. And so that's, when you go, how did Christianity really spread and then help to develop? It was through these mendicant orders, especially the Dominicans. Now, I think today there's about 30 different orders within the Catholic Church, male orders, female orders, and so on. But these were some of the more early prominent ones that helped establish Christianity throughout Europe.
Well, that same thing happened to this country too. For instance, the Protestants, of course, had their own people doing that.
Right.
I read somewhere where these guys would go into a town. It was a rough, western town, and they would actually go to the local tavern and they'd begin preaching.
Yeah.
And they say within like a half an hour, 1/3 of the guys would be fighting each other. The other third would be saved, and the other third wouldn't do anything. They just sit there. I mean, it really stirred up a lot. That's
Well,
how things grew.
Methodist was indeed one of the most successful early church movements in the early young United States because of the itinerant preachers. And they would go from town to town. And I know even when I was in seminary, young seminarians were graduating and then going into the United Methodist Church and other churches, and they would call them like a 2-point charge or a 3-point charge, where they would have multiple churches where they would serve. And of course, this is the day when you had cars, so you could have a church service in one town at 9 a.m. and a church service in another town at 11 or 11:30. Okay, there's also what I would call scholastic spirituality. People like Anselm and Thomas Aquinas are some of the famous writers, and to this day, Thomas Aquinas is considered the greatest theologian of the Catholic Church, and frankly, Thomas Aquinas's theology had a great impact later on the Anglican Church, which had a great impact on the Methodist Church, and in many respects, except for the kind of the Catholic, a lot of the Catholic worship practices. I would make the argument that Methodism favors a lot more of Roman Catholic theology than Lutheran and Reformed Calvinistic theology. Now, clearly Luther and Reformed and Calvin were Protestants, and Anglicans and Methodists were Protestant. And there are some significant differences, as we saw when we looked at the articles of religion of the United Methodist Church. A lot of them were stated against the Roman Catholic Church. But a lot of the basic beliefs about human responsibility and sin and so on really comes more from people like Thomas Aquinas than a Luther or a Calvin. At least I would make that case. Anyway, last slide here. There's always been a presence of what people call mystical spirituality. I mean, even going back into the ancient church, the whole idea of the three movements of purification, contemplation, and communion or unification with God. That kind of process regularly occurred throughout church history. And during this time, some very well-known spiritualists were known, people like Meister Eckhart and Catherine of Siena, which is in Italy. Meister Eckhart was in Germany. There were a lot of women writers during this period. One of the few areas where women could write and publish that was accepted by Christendom were those who were more mystical, spiritually oriented people. So you had people like Hildegard of Bingen in Germany, and Brigitte of Sweden, and Julian of Norwich in England. These are all people who are still read today by people who seek to live a deeper spiritual life. They often look to these medieval authors for. And then last but not least is what was called the modern devotion, or devotio moderna. I mean, this was the 14th century, so how modern is it? But they called it modern devotion at that time.
Well, it was modern for them.
It was modern for them. Basically, what these and the leading advocates were people like Gert Groot in the Netherlands, and then Thomas à Kempis in I don't know where he was. I think he's in France, where they basically said in the past these spiritual disciplines of prayer and fasting and devotion and contemplation and meditation of Scripture was something thought to be done primarily by priests and nuns in monasteries. And if you really wanted to become spiritual or holy, you became a nun or a monk and went to a monastery and practiced these practices. Well, basically, people like Groot and Thomas à Kempis said, no, this is for everyone. And Thomas à Kempis wrote a book entitled The Imitation of Christ, which I don't know specific numbers, but it has been said that in Western civilization, next to the Bible, no nonfiction book has been published more than Thomas à Kempis's book, The Imitation of Christ. And I've read The Imitation of Christ, and it's got some old kind of ideas there because it was written in the 15th century. But basically, that idea of the imitation of Christ has continued to be a profound model of how Christians today seek to become more Christ-like, more holy, more perfect, more spiritual, more mature, however you want to refer to it. And it has to do with the intentional practices of these spiritual disciplines, like prayer, fellowship, meditation on Scripture, contemplation of God, regular worship, fasting, and so on. So, questions?
Just comment, Jesus did that. He often left the crowds to go out and meditate and pray on their own. So it's kind of
Right.
normal.
And basically, spiritual discipline, most people who advocate for spiritual discipline say that Jesus kind of represented all of these.
Yeah.
Yeah. We do these because these are things we saw Jesus do. He fellowshiped, he worshiped,
Yeah.
he fasted, he prayed.
Just
Yep.
maybe unrelated, but talk about the Dominicans, Franciscans. Where did the Jesuits fit in all of that?
Well, the Jesuits don't come about until after the Protestant Reformation. Ignatius Loyola was considered the founder of the Jesuit movement. He had been a soldier who was then injured, who then went into the priesthood. And he made the Jesuits distinctive in that he used his military organization and regimentation to really make the Jesuits more assertive in how they went out and promoted the gospel. The Jesuits did not start the Inquisition. The Inquisition began before the time, and I don't really get into the Inquisition. Actually, I could have included that now that I think about it, but I didn't. The Inquisition began in Spain during the 14th and 15th century, but then in the 16th century, after the Protestant Reformation began, the Inquisition became more aggressive, and the Jesuits were among the leaders in persecuting anyone who was considered apostate, and that included Protestants,
Yeah.
because they were not submissive to the Pope.
They were the Pope's pit bulls, Jesuits.
But now what if the Jesuits are known for their teaching in there.
Well,
They're scholarly.
nowadays, Jesuits, yes, it's my understanding that the majority of Catholic universities in the United States now are Jesuit. And that probably is a bit of a reflection of how much they emphasize organization and structured leadership. And, you know, the Franciscans were more poverty oriented. The Dominicans were more kind of teaching oriented, academically oriented. The Jesuits were more administratively oriented, and that helped them to become very widespread and prominent and influential.
Boston College is Jesuit, Notre Dame is Holy Cross Order. The Jesuits, their education is actually far beyond a PhD. I mean, it's many, many years. Those guys know everything. They really are learning to become a full Jesuit priest. It's a big deal for the Catholics.
Yeah. Well, next week I will be gone, and I had forgotten to ask anyone to take my place, and so I'm currently in negotiations with Kim to do something. So be very gracious on Kim, because I'm putting him in a tough spot. But then in 2 weeks when we come back, then I'm going to do one more series of historical handouts, and it'll be on the Reformation. We'll talk about the Reformation, transitioning from the medieval period to the Reformation. And I'm going to include a couple of other, what I would call after Reformation developments, especially what's called the Pietistic movement or the evangelical revivals in the century following the Protestant Reformation, because they include such things as the Pietist movement in Central Europe, the Methodist movement in the British Islands, and then what's called the Great Awakening, or First Great Awakening in the American colonies. And that's where it'll end. Because I kind of wanted to loop in our own traditions there. And if in the future you want me to do church history from Methodism onward, I'll do that, but we're going to get back into the Bible, when after we do these historical studies. Yeah.
Yeah, have you thought about, for instance, letting us know how the King James Bible came about, and why there were like 150 Bibles after that? I mean, what's wrong with the King James? Why so many different Bibles? What happened there? I mean, we have the NIV and the ASV and the RV, and it goes on forever. Why so many Bibles?
I hear that wall right there.
Yeah.
So,
I'd like to know.
somewhat facetiously, but somewhat seriously, I would say my two leading reasons would be, one, is because everyone thinks they know how to interpret the Bible best. But second of all, to make money. The Bible is the best-selling book in the world.
Yeah, it's true.
And let me just tell you a little bit about the Bibles we use in the United Methodist Church. Okay? For many decades, we have used the New Revised Standard Version, NRSV, which is it was a 1980 revision of the RSV, the Revised Standard Version. Well, the Standard Version was considered the King James Version. That was a standard version, 1611. In the beginning of the 20th century, not just Methodists, but also other denominations like the Presbyterian Church and Lutheran Church and so on, wanted an updated version over the King James Version. So they created what was called the Revised Version. Well, then in the 80s, they had the New Revised Standard Version. And then just in the last 5 years, there's yet another. It's called the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. NRSVUE. which is the official Bible now of the National Council of Churches, which the United Methodist Church is a part of. And the United Methodist Church actually is sort of the overseer of that translation. Now, and my good friend Kathy Armistead was on the committee for the newest version. And I go, she says, I don't know why they wanted to do it. They made not that many changes, but she said they were losing sales because there were other translations that were said ours are newer and more up to date with more a deeper understanding of more recent manuscripts that have been discovered, and so their sales were dropping. And so they made what she considered relatively minor changes. So now, in any publication from the National Council of Churches or the United Methodist Church, it must be in the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. So I just published a book last year on the Council of Nicaea. And I had to go through myself and look up every single Bible verse because all of a sudden I was told, well, it's all got to be now the NRSVUE. So I had to go and there are almost no changes, but I had to make sure everyone was correct. So there are many reasons for why there are other translations. But to be honest, the most basic reason is once Luther came along in the 16th century, and he argued, and other Protestants did, for what he called the veracity of the text, that anyone can read the Bible and figure out truth for themselves. Then everyone said, I have more truth than everyone else. I like my way of understanding and interpreting the Bible.
Well, of course.
And especially anyone who knew Greek and Hebrew said, I think my Greek and Hebrew translation is better than everyone else. And even though the differences from other editions might be, only 1% different, it's still different. And some people make a big deal out of those differences. Now keep in mind that over the past 200, 300 years, we have found thousands of ancient manuscripts. And one of the challenges is, like I talked about the Textus Receptus, this is back in the 16th century. Well, since that one was found, they've found so many older manuscripts that are considered more reliable than what the Textus Receptus was built on. Well, that upsets people who like to read the King James Version because the King James Version is based on the Textus Receptus. But some of us have newer Bibles, and you'll read the footnote and it'll say, older manuscripts don't have this phrase, or older manuscripts say something else. Well, as we keep discovering new manuscripts, and sometimes what are thought to be older manuscripts, people want to make modifications. So there's just a lot of reasons for why there's so many different Bibles. But don't think that money and loot are too far from one of the reasons for why it's done. I hate to sound cynical there, but I'm shocked, I tell you. Taking a line from the movie Casablanca. All right, let me close in prayer. Dear God, again,